Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another DADCAW. It is 10:32 in the morning of Tuesday, the 17th of November, 2020. We're going to be talking about content development as well as the environment in which you create your content and why it's important to have a nice foundation and all that stuff. But specifically regarding Hydra, which has been in development for quite a while now, that's where I want to start us off and sort of reminder of why it's important to have a solid foundation. Just at every turn when we work on Broodwork content, we seem to be reminded of the importance of another engine coming into play in the very near future. So obviously that's in some ways disheartening because we've worked so heavily on the environment of Hydra so that we could then create single player and cooperative and player versus player content, as in maps or game modes within the environment of the mod, essentially leveraging the new game state in a way to deliver different kinds of experiences. Since we've worked so hard on such things, only for it to essentially result in us having to move on to a new engine and work so hard on the environment once again, it doesn't really feel like we've been able to properly sink our teeth into content development throughout most of this time. So in a roundabout way, the mod itself, the game state itself of Hydra, is content. It's not really the same thing as an environment because it's not really the same thing as an engine, but it muddies the waters because we've essentially taken it upon ourselves to update the engine, to take the engine's limitations that we are running up against and extend them to make it so that we can actually implement the ideas that we want with less to no compromises. That is a very tall order for somebody who's just trying to make content and not necessarily trying to develop a brand new engine within which to make content. But that is why we've decided to move on with the new engine, because it seems so impossible and improbable to actually put together some content within this scrap cobble piece of junk engine that we're dealing with, that being StarCraft's engine, of course. And one of the main things that I took away from the recent developments was that even though we do still want to make that last push into Brood War, similar to the previous DADCAW, or one of the most recent DADCAWs was the Last Call for Brood War 1, where I went into detail about sort of our plans for the project, for Project Hydra, but also for just in general facilitating some sort of custom content that would be less limited than what we had to deal with for most of our time within the engine. We do still have those plans, that has not changed, but it certainly reminded me of why it's really important to get another thing out there, to get another set of content out there. And something that I want to focus on in general when I'm working on the engine is making sure we don't run into all of the same issues. In a way, it's actually kind of good that we've seen a bunch of different RTS games that were built in a bunch of different RTS engines, all of which had different shortcomings. Some of which had similar, there's certainly some overlap there, and all of which had different strengths as well. And obviously working within Brood War for long enough, as well as dabbling in other games like Warcraft 3 and StarCraft 2, though the definition of game is stretched rather thin there, I would say that I've gathered a very different perspective on what actually impacts the content development process. So much so that if I were just trying to develop an engine such that I could create content, I think that's a better even methodology to conceptualize. Like it's really important to separate these two discussion points, the content versus the environment. It's really important to make your points about this and figure out how you feel about these things. Because, for my money, the content itself is king, but you can't have the good content unless you have a solid foundation, unless you have a solid environment. And at that point, really, the engine's only role is to give way to content, to support content, to allow for the creation of content. And then the content itself is supposed to essentially be able to, I would argue, for the most part, unless you're actually of the proclivity to have a focus in game design, you shouldn't notice anything to do with the engine. You should only be noticing the content. And the engine, the environment, that's supposed to be the support staff, the support network of, say, like a Broadway play or movie or something, where all the things that are behind the scenes, all the things that are not seen, and really it would take a trained eye or somebody who's really invested into the subject matter to go into the like the backing information, right? The developer commentary or something. It would take something like that. Either somebody who's already knows what to look for, or somebody who seeks out the information when it's made available to see all of the makings of the development process, to see where something is facilitated because of an engine upgrade or an engine change. For example, most people are not going to simply look at a large number of on-screen units and think, oh yeah, that's related to the engine. They're just going to think, oh, this content involves large numbers of units. But in StarCraft, you don't get that. You can't have more than like 1,700 units. So the idea of being limited in such a very mundane manner, I mean, most people don't even think about that. Most people don't even conceptualize that. If they see more than 100 bullets on screen at a time, they don't think, wow, that's because of an engine upgrade or because they're using an up-to-date engine or a new engine. They just think, oh yeah, 100 bullets, whatever. So these are cases where we are very inherently, intrinsically limited within the Brood War context. But we are able to completely ignore those with our own engine. And ideally, the way that we would conceptualize it, I think, is that we would essentially have the opportunity to produce content within the engine. And that will be a nice litmus test for whether or not it feels like our environment is up to task, whether or not our engine is up to task. Because if we don't have a good time actually producing content, then obviously the engine is not yet ready to go there. So if there's something wrong with the pipeline, if the experience is just not as joyous as it could be to assemble certain elements and put together like a map, for example, or updates to a mod, updates to a game state, something like that, then we are missing something and we need to correct that void, as it were, fill that void. So the other thing I think should be mentioned here in this sort of tangent of discussing the role of an engine, the role of environment when it comes to content, and how it's mostly supportive and foundational and not really like you don't. I'll put it to you this way: there's some counter examples of this kind of behavior. I think all of the Half-Life games were examples of this, and to a lesser extent, the first Quake game, where they were limited in a technical sense in some ways, but also less limited in a technical sense in other ways, such that they decided to lean into essentially turning their game into a tech demo for what the engine could do. And especially Half-Life 2 is a huge victim to this. And this is one of the main reasons why that game never really had any objective success, we'll say. Obviously, it had plenty of financial and cultural success. But when it comes to the experience of playing the game, the reason why it's so bad is precisely because they focus mostly on showing off what the engine could do and less so on creating content, less so on creating and proselytizing their ability to make high quality content, right? So in that sense, the engine was part of the content. The environment was part of the content, and muddying the waters like that gets you in a very confusing experience. I guess I can't necessarily say that every single time you do that, it would 100% of the time be objectively bad. I think I would have to evaluate more examples of this behavior. But in Half-Life 2's case, that was one of the main reasons why the game was so bad, is because once you get past the novelty factor of whatever the engine provides, for example, if you go back and play it years after it's released and you've already experienced some of the things that it innovated on an engine level, then the engine no longer has value as content. And it's only usable for a gimmick. It's only usable for a bit of a novelty thing. And then after that, it becomes just another game that uses these mechanics or has these aspects to its engine. And you as a player are not usually supposed to be thinking in those terms. You're usually supposed to be engaged by the content. So in such a situation, I think that's like one very obvious example that comes to mind, where games are going through this evolutionary process with their foundations, their engines, their environments. And that's shaping how the content itself is created. And you're almost leveraging the engine itself, the environment itself, as if it were content. That's not something that we want to do in our own engine, right? I'm sure there will be some people who have more experimental takes. I think iQuare is a perfect example of a content developer who does a lot of experimental stuff. And I think also, given enough time, iQuare would eventually like refine and figure out like, okay, what works and what doesn't, what needs more work, what seems like a dead end, and trim the fat, as it were, or refine down concepts that seem like they have potential but are not working yet into something that could work. If you played his Overlord demo, or if you saw my playthrough of it on this channel a while back, maybe last week or so, you will also have probably come to some similar conclusion. There's just so many new things, so many different aspects of the game state that he's created are experimental, are brand new to StarCraft custom content, have never been tried before, to the point where it feels like that is a big portion, I think, of what the experience offers. But again, that experience has value insofar as it ends up being gimmicky or novel, some sort of a novelty or something to that effect. Less so objective value. That's where you have to refine the concepts and really integrate them properly, which is obviously something that was beyond the scope of the time constraints of the contest. So not necessarily something I had an expectation for, but certainly something that, iQuare has already observed himself, I think, that needs to be taken care of. So that's another example, I guess, that's a little bit more relevant time-wise and also content-wise to the channel, of when you're sort of blurring the lines between what is your environment, what is your engine, and what is your content, what is your product. Because a lot of the time, I do think that developers might conflate the two. They might conceptualize, for example, being able to reshape terrain dynamically, or having destructible objects or something like that. They might conceptualize that possibility for an environmental thing in an RTS, some sort of engine-based mechanic that can happen in an RTS context, as content, as something that should be capitalized upon and used all the time. And I guess it's better to use it more than less in most cases, because then at least it's a consistent mechanic. But a lot of the times it ends up not feeling too hot in that respect, precisely because this is just a feature, a function of the game, a function of the engine. And it's more how you leverage it that makes a difference. And that's where I think a lot of people will stumble initially when they're making their first game. So this is something that I'm acutely aware of myself, and certainly something that I want to check. Some might leverage a similar criticism to the current Hydra game state as of the time of recording, where maybe every unit having some sort of unique passive, or virtually every unit, for the most part, the vast majority of units having some sort of unique passive, that's unlocked by GPTP and by A's and by these plugins that we didn't have access to years ago. And so maybe some might consider that to be the same sort of thing, where I'm leveraging a function of the engine, of the environment, and it's having a negative and disproportionate influence on the content. Maybe that's the case. We are obviously going through a variety of different valuations when it comes to a lot of these things. Like, we're trying to get to the point where we don't have unit ID limits, so that we can have infinite numbers of units, and then at that point we can have like tier 2 production structures and tier 1 through 10 units and all this other crazy shit that I've got planned, and that outmodes a lot of outmodes upgrades. Then you can like start to refactor individual unit roles and see what needs to be changed there. There's a lot that you can do under an environment like that, where you have the capacity to do it, that will shape the content. And in that particular sense, it's a different kind of experience for sure. So because that's still evolving as time goes on, because that's still taking shape before our eyes, I would not be surprised to find some sort of agreeable take that, oh yeah, Hydra has some foundational issues, because in many ways it is limited by the environment, and as such, a lot of the concepts are compromises. Or a lot of the content, rather, is a compromise. But going back to Hydra itself, because again, the main thrust of this entire video was initially meant to be conceptualizing making maps versus developing the mod as content and environment, respectively. I think it's an easy way to conceptualize that, and the fact that we haven't been able to make a lot of maps using this game state that we find ourselves using for most anything at this point. Mapcraft can attenuate that somewhat, but for the most part, a lot of the maps that have been put together by me in recent history have been like birthday maps, or they've been goofball Mapcraft maps. And in neither case do they feel like I was really gunning it for an objectively ideal scenario or end result. And I do feel like there's room for that still, but at the same time, if I start working on content and stop working on the environment, then the content could potentially not be as good as it could be. And then there's also the sunken cost issue of maybe I work on a map that has a certain aspect to its layout that's rather permeated, but I change something about the game state or I add something new to the game state, and that completely flips the balance on its head and changes a whole bunch of shit, and then would require me to, in theory, remake a large portion of it. That hangs over the head. I think back in February of this year, I probably talked about this, or maybe it was even last year. I probably talked about this very concept of the idea that since Hydra is still in development and seems like it'll forever be in development, it feels really difficult to get into content development for the project because you never know what's going to change about the game state, about the balance, and what you might need to update. And since then, I think I have, for one, the game state is somewhat stable at this point. Like maybe there's going to be new units or whatever, but there's not going to be foundational changes like removing most upgrades and enabling most abilities by default and stuff. There's not going to be anything that's foundational like that, like changing the role and impact of upgrades and stuff like that, where these deep-seated changes into the foundation of all of the content that you experience are going to come in and completely change the ramifications of design decisions that were made beforehand. I don't think that's going to happen in the future now. I think we've gotten to a relatively stable point for the Brood War incarnation of Hydra, and for the new engine, who the fuck knows, right? Suffice it to say, I think at this point it's a safe bet that I can jump back into actual content development using the engine or using the game state that we have here for Hydra as my environment. I can start working on campaigns again, probably original content more so than the remakes, but we'll see how that pans out. I can hopefully start working on some Nemesis scenarios, some other game mode scenarios, some various other maps. Obviously, my brother's birthday is coming up again, and that's going to be its own birthday project, as it always is every year. But it looks like we'll be using Hydra's game state for that, which is pretty exciting. Obviously, I'll make some one-off custom alterations, I'm sure. But yeah, ultimately, we are looking pretty on point to get back into content development. Obviously, given the idea that we are staying within Brood War for the small window of time that it takes us to get the engine operational enough to have actual content development capabilities. And I say small window of time, hopefully, optimistically, not objectively or factually or based on any actual prediction. So we'll see how that goes out. We'll see how that pans out. I am really looking forward to not only jumping into content development, but also jumping into engine development. Hopefully by the end of this month, we will have jumped into that with actual engine dev streams and all the rest. But that is in part dependent on others, and also in part dependent on my own personal schedule, how that shapes up with all of the other things I've been doing. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this little update log on what's been going down with content development versus the environment development, and sort of where my headspace is at for developing some stuff using the Hydra game state. There will be some things released in the near future. That is the TLDW on this video. So check it out when it comes out.